What do you do when life keeps knocking you down? When every challenge feels like it might break you? For Daniel, it was never about avoiding failure. It was about learning to rise again and again. This is the story of a man who refused to let his past define him and discovered that true strength is found in perseverance. But before we start, don't forget to subscribe for more stories. Now let's begin. The wind howled through the empty streets as Daniel Carter tightened his grip on the straps of his worn-out backpack. The city that had once been his home now felt like a cold, indifferent void. A month ago, he had a steady job, a comfortable apartment, and a routine that made him feel secure. Now, all of it was gone. The company he had given 10 years of his life to had crumbled overnight, leaving him with nothing but a severance check that barely covered his last rent. Friends who once called him for weekend drinks stopped answering his calls. The world had moved on, and Daniel was left behind. He stood on the edge of the sidewalk, staring at the endless stretch of road ahead. He had no destination, no plan, only a single thought echoing in his mind. Keep walking. He took the first step. The weight of his backpack was heavy, but not as heavy as the burden in his chest. Every footstep felt like an act of defiance against the world that had abandoned him. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay. As he walked, the city gave way to the outskirts, gas stations, empty fields, and long stretches of highway. The honking of cars faded, replaced by the rhythmic sound of his boots against the pavement. He had no money for buses or trains. Walking was all he had. By nightfall, exhaustion clawed at him. He found an old bus stop and sat on the metal bench, dropping his backpack at his feet. The hunger gnawed at his stomach, but he ignored it. He had to ration the few granola bars he had left. The streetlights flickered, and he pulled his jacket tighter around him. He wasn't afraid of the night. He was afraid of the thoughts that crept in when the world went silent. What am I doing? Where am I going? Before he could sink too deep into his own doubts, a voice interrupted. Rough night? Daniel turned to see a man sitting on the opposite bench. He hadn't noticed him before. The man was older, with graying hair and a face that had seen its share of hardship. He wore a thick coat, and beside him was a small duffel. Bag. Something like that, Daniel replied. The man nodded. Name's Robert. Daniel. You got somewhere to be, Daniel? Daniel hesitated. He didn't want to admit that he had no real plan, that he was just a man drifting between lost and broken. I'm just walking, he finally said. Robert chuckled. You and me both. For a while, they sat in silence. Then Robert reached into his bag and pulled out a wrapped sandwich. He took a bite, and then, without a word, handed the other half to Daniel. Daniel hesitated. He hadn't asked for help, but his stomach growled in protest. Swallowing his pride, he took the sandwich. Thanks. Don't mention it, Robert said, chewing thoughtfully. People like us, we gotta look out for each other. Daniel studied him. Like us? The ones the world forgets. Daniel exhaled slowly. He had never thought of himself as forgotten. But maybe he was. Maybe that was exactly what had happened. As the night wore on, Robert told him about his own journey, how he had lost his family, his job, his home. But instead of letting it break him, he had decided to keep moving, to meet people, to learn from the road. You learn a lot when you have nothing, Robert said, leaning back against the bench. You find out who you really are. Daniel wasn't sure if he wanted to find out who he was, but as the night stretched on, for the first time in weeks, he didn't feel completely alone. Maybe this journey wasn't about escaping. Maybe it was about discovering something he had lost long ago. And with that thought, Daniel closed his eyes, listening to the distant sound of cars passing by, knowing that tomorrow he would keep walking. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp pavement and distant pine trees. Daniel woke to the sound of cars passing by, their tires humming against the highway. For a brief moment, he forgot where he was. Then, the stiffness in his back and the weight of his backpack reminded him he was nowhere and everywhere. Robert was already awake, sipping from a dented thermos. He gave Daniel a nod, then took a long swig before handing it over. Coffee, he said simply. Daniel hesitated, but took it. The warmth spread through his fingers, and when he took a sip, the bitterness jolted him awake. He hadn't realized how much he missed something as simple as a morning coffee. "Where are you headed?" Daniel finally asked, handing the thermos back. "Nowhere in particular," Robert said, stretching. "Wherever the road takes me." Daniel nodded. That was his path now, too. As the sun began to rise, the two men packed their bags and started walking. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, but neither of them seemed to mind. The silence between them was comfortable, broken only by the occasional car rushing past. They walked for miles. Hunger came and went, dulled by the steady rhythm of their footsteps. When they reached a gas station, Robert reached into his pocket and pulled out a few crumpled bills. "How about some breakfast?" Daniel frowned. "I don't want to take your money." Robert chuckled. "I didn't ask if you wanted to. Come on." Inside, the warm smell of coffee and fried food filled the air. They grabbed a couple of breakfast sandwiches and sat at a small table in the corner. Daniel ate slowly, savoring every bite. He had never thought much about food before, but now every meal felt like a blessing. "So, what's your story?" Robert asked, watching him. Daniel wiped his mouth with a napkin, thinking. "I had a job, a life. Thought I had everything figured out. Then it all disappeared." Robert nodded, as if he had heard it all before. "And now you're walking." Daniel shrugged. "I guess so." Robert leaned back in his chair. "You think you're running from something?" The question caught Daniel off guard. He had been telling himself that he was moving forward, but was he really? Or was he just trying to escape? "I don't know," he admitted. Robert took another sip of his coffee. "The road has a way of teaching you things, whether you want to learn or not." They finished their meal, thanked the cashier, and stepped back, onto the road. The hours passed, the sun climbing high into the sky. The highway slowly gave way to smaller roads, lined with trees and occasional farmhouses. The sound of traffic faded, replaced by the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves in the wind. As they walked, they spotted an old barn in the distance. A man in overalls was working near a fence, hammering a wooden post into the ground. Robert grinned. "Come on, let's see if he needs a hand." Daniel hesitated. "You just walk up to strangers and offer to work?" Robert shrugged. "It's an honest way to earn a meal." They approached, and the farmer looked up, wiping sweat from his forehead. He eyed them both before nodding. "You boys looking for work?" "Something like that," Robert said. The farmer studied them for a moment, then pointed to a pile of hay bales stacked near the barn. "You help me move those. I'll see what I can do." Daniel rolled up his sleeves. The work was hard, the sun beating down on them. But for the first time in a while, he felt a strange sense of purpose. Each bale of hay he lifted, each step he took, it all felt real. When they finished, the farmer led them inside his house, where a simple but hearty meal was waiting. Fresh bread, cheese, and cold lemonade. As Daniel ate, he realized something. This journey wasn't just about surviving. It was about learning how to live again. That night, as he lay in the barn on a pile of hay, listening to the distant sounds of the countryside, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The morning sun poured through the gaps in the barn walls, painting streaks of gold across the floor. Daniel stretched, feeling the dull ache in his muscles from the previous day's labor. It was a good kind of soreness, the kind that reminded him he had done something real. Robert was already up, sitting on an overturned crate, sharpening a small pocket knife with slow, practiced strokes. He glanced at Daniel with a knowing smirk. "Not bad for a city boy," he said. Daniel chuckled. Felt good to actually work for something. The barn door creaked open, and the farmer, whose name they had learned was Henry, stepped inside. He had a mug of coffee in one hand and a tired but satisfied look on his face. "You two earned your meal," he said. "But I gotta ask, where? You boys headed?" Daniel glanced at Robert, who simply smiled and said, "Wherever the road leads." Henry nodded, as if he understood. "Well, I appreciate the help. You're welcome to stay another night if you need to." Daniel considered it, but something inside him told him to keep moving. "Thanks, but I think we'll head out." Robert stood and stretched. A man's gotta keep walking after all. Henry reached into his pocket and pulled out a few crumpled bills. "It ain't much, but take it. Get yourselves a decent meal down the road." Daniel hesitated. He wasn't used to accepting charity, but Henry's expression told him this wasn't charity. It was gratitude. "Thank you," Daniel said, taking the money. Henry gave them a nod and disappeared back into the house. By mid-morning, they were back on the road, their boots kicking up dust as they walked along the quiet country highway. "You ever think about staying somewhere?" Daniel asked after a while. Robert raised an eyebrow. "You mean settling down?" "Yeah. Stopping. Starting over." Robert took a deep breath, staring at the road ahead. "I used to think that way. But the truth is, the road is my home now." Daniel frowned. "But don't you ever miss having, I don't know, stability?" Robert laughed. "Stability is an illusion, kid. You had a stable life once, didn't you?" Daniel fell silent. He had, and it had fallen apart in an instant. They walked for hours, the road stretching endlessly before them. The world felt vast, yet oddly peaceful. As they neared a small roadside diner, the scent of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee filled the air. Robert patted his stomach. "Let's see if we can turn Henry's kindness into a real breakfast." Inside, the diner was nearly empty. A waitress with tired eyes and a kind smile greeted them and took their order. As Daniel sipped his coffee, he found himself staring at the counter where an old radio played soft country music. The sound of it, the simple atmosphere of the diner, made him feel like he was in a different world. Then, the bell above the door jingled. A man walked in, mid-50s, thick beard, rough hands. He sat at the counter, ordered a black coffee, and pulled a folded newspaper from his pocket. Robert nudged Daniel. "Watch this." He got up, walked over to the man, and casually said, "What's a guy like you doing in a place like this?" The man looked up, confused, then broke into a grin. "Robert, you old son of a..." Daniel watched in surprise as the two men shook hands like old friends. Robert gestured for Daniel to come over. "Dan, meet Joe. We go way back." Joe chuckled. "Met this fool years ago in Louisiana. We worked on a fishing boat together for a bit." Daniel blinked. "You worked on a fishing boat?" Robert shrugged. "You'd be surprised where the road takes you." Joe sipped his coffee. "So, what brings you two this way?" Robert smiled. "Just passing through." Joe studied Daniel. "First time on the road?" Daniel hesitated, then nodded. Joe smirked. "Takes some getting used to, but you learn a lot about yourself out here." Daniel thought about that. Was he learning, or was he still just running? Joe leaned back. "Listen, if you boys need some work, I know a guy up north who runs a repair shop, always looking for hands." Daniel glanced at Robert, who simply shrugged. "Might be worth checking out." Joe scribbled an address on a napkin and slid it across the counter. "Tell him Joe sent you." Daniel took the napkin, staring at the inked letters. A direction, a purpose. Maybe this road wasn't just about walking. Maybe it was about finding something he hadn't even known he was looking for. And so, they walked on. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, as Daniel and Robert left the diner behind. The napkin with Joe's scribbled address was folded carefully in Daniel's pocket, as if it carried some hidden weight. They walked in silence for a while, the road stretching endlessly ahead of them. The sound of their boots against the pavement was steady, rhythmic, like the ticking of a clock neither of them could see. Daniel finally broke the silence. "You think this repair shop is worth checking out?" Robert glanced at him, smirking. "You're looking for something, aren't you?" Daniel hesitated. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Stability, maybe, or proof that he wasn't just a drifter now. I need to know I can still build something," he admitted. Robert nodded, as if he understood. "Then let's see where the road takes us." They walked through the night, stopping briefly to rest beneath an overpass. The city lights in the distance flickered like stars, distant and unreachable. By morning, they reached the outskirts of a small town. It had the kind of charm that belonged in old postcards. Brick buildings, quiet streets, a diner with a neon sign flickering uncertainly against the pale morning sky. The address Joe had given them led to a modest auto repair shop at the edge of town. The metal sign out front was rusted, but the name was still legible: Harper's Repairs. Daniel felt a strange nervousness settle in his chest as they stepped inside. The place smelled of motor oil and grease, the air thick with the sound of tools clanking against metal. Behind the counter, a man in his 60s with silver hair and a deep scar running down his left forearm was flipping through an old ledger. He looked up as they entered, his sharp blue eyes studying them with the scrutiny of a man who had seen a lot in his years. "Help you, boys?" Robert stepped forward with his usual easy confidence. "Joe sent us. Said you might have work." The old man, Harper, presumably raised an eyebrow, then set the ledger down. He looked them over, as if trying to decide whether they were worth his time. "You two ever work with cars before?" Robert shrugged. "A little here and there." Daniel hesitated. "Not really, but I'm a fast learner." Harper let out a small huff, then gestured for them to follow. The garage was cluttered, but functional. A car sat on a lift, its underbelly exposed like an open wound. A younger man, maybe in his late 20s, was working beneath it, his face partially obscured by a mechanic's cap. Harper nodded toward him. "That's my grandson, Eli. He handles most of the work around here these days." Eli barely acknowledged. Them focused on tightening a bolt. Harper turned back to Daniel and Robert. "I don't hire drifters," he said flatly. "You want a job? You prove you can work." Robert grinned. "Sounds fair." Harper nodded toward a pile of old tires, stacked against the far wall. "Those need moving out back. Get started." Daniel glanced at Robert, who gave him a look that said, "This is part of the test." Without a word, they got to work. The tires were heavier than they looked, and the morning sun was relentless. Sweat dripped down Daniel's back as he lifted and carried, the scent of rubber thick in the air. Robert worked steadily beside him, never complaining, never slowing down. There was something reassuring about his presence, as if no matter what happened, he would just keep moving forward. Eli occasionally glanced their way, but he said nothing, just kept working on the car. By noon, they had moved every last tire. Daniel wiped the sweat from his brow, his muscles burning with exhaustion. Harper walked over, arms crossed. "Didn't think you'd finish." Daniel straightened, meeting his gaze. "We're not looking for handouts." Harper studied him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "Come back tomorrow. We'll see what you're really made of." Daniel exhaled, a mix of relief and determination filling his chest. It wasn't much, but it was something. As they left the garage, Robert clapped him on the back. "Looks like you might just be rebuilding something after all." Daniel looked back at the shop, then down at his hands, calloused, sore, but steady. Maybe, just maybe, the road was leading him somewhere after all. The next morning, Daniel woke to the sound of birds singing outside the small room they had rented above a diner. The town, still wrapped in early morning fog, was just beginning to stir. The streetlights flickered out as the sun began its slow ascent, casting a pale light over the buildings. Robert was already up, sitting by the window, a mug of coffee in his hands. He was quiet, lost in thought, but the faint trace of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You ready for today?" he asked, not looking at Daniel, but at the town outside. Daniel stretched, feeling the weight of the past few days in his bones. "Yeah, I think I am." They didn't speak much as they made their way back to Harper's shop, the early morning air cool and crisp. The road ahead was still long, and though Daniel wasn't sure where it would lead, he knew that today was just another step forward. Harper was already at the garage when they arrived, wearing the same weathered overalls and old boots as yesterday. His blue eyes flicked over them as they stepped inside. "You back for more?" he asked, a small glint of amusement in his voice. "We're here to work," Robert said, his tone steady. Harper didn't respond right away, just stared at them for a moment, as though weighing their sincerity. He then gave a short grunt. "All right then. Eli's working on the engine. You two are with me today." They followed him into the back of the shop, where a large truck sat on the lift. Its engine was a mess of wires and metal, clearly in need of a thorough overhaul. Harper handed them a set of tools. "Let's see if you can make a difference. Get that engine clean and ready to go." As the hours passed, the work became grueling. The heat of the shop was oppressive, and the air was thick with grease and oil. Daniel's hands grew slick with sweat and grime, but he didn't stop. Robert worked alongside him, his rhythm steady, and at times Daniel could almost forget the world outside, lost in the mechanical rhythm of turning bolts and fixing parts. It was nothing like the clean, air-conditioned office jobs he used to know. There were no deadlines here, no expectations beyond doing the job right. As the sun reached its peak, Harper came by to check on their progress. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching them work in silence. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out. Daniel glanced over at Robert, whose expression remained unchanged. "What do you think?" Daniel asked, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "Don't know. He's not one to hand out compliments," Robert replied. Hours passed, and the truck's engine slowly began to take shape. The pile of discarded parts and tools grew larger as the two men made progress. By late afternoon, the engine was clean, the parts reassembled, and the truck sat gleaming under the harsh shop lights. Harper returned, his gaze sweeping over the work. He didn't say anything at first. He just walked around the truck, inspecting it closely. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. "You did good," he said, his voice low but approving. Daniel didn't know how to respond at first. He had worked hard, yes, but he had never expected praise. It felt strange, this unexpected approval. "You'll do." Harper's voice broke the silence again. "Come by tomorrow. We'll see if you can keep up." The words hung in the air, and for the first time since Daniel had set out on this journey, he felt something deep inside him shift. Maybe it wasn't about finding something permanent. Maybe it was about proving he could still build. That night, as Daniel lay on the cot in their room above the diner, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The road had become more than just an escape. It was a chance to rebuild. Not just his life, but himself. And as he closed his eyes, drifting off to sleep, he realized that the man who had once felt so broken was beginning to piece himself back together, one step at a time. The next few days followed a similar rhythm. Daniel and Robert worked at Harper's shop, earning their keep with each day that passed. The work was hard and the hours were long, but it felt different now. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about rebuilding something real, something tangible. With each truck they fixed, each tire they replaced, Daniel felt the weight of the past lifting, bit by bit. The man he had been, the one who had once had everything and lost it all, was slowly being replaced by a man who understood what it meant to start over. Harper, though gruff and reserved, became a silent mentor. Daniel picked up his pace, learned the intricacies of engines, and found a strange satisfaction in the simple acts of fixing and rebuilding. He found that the rhythm of it, the turning of wrenches, the tightening of bolts, was meditative. It gave him something to focus on, something to hold on to. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult repair, Harper approached him again. "You're getting better at this," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. Daniel looked up, surprised by the praise. "Thanks." Harper gave him a small nod. "Sometimes you just have to get your hands dirty before you figure out what you can do." It was a simple lesson, but it resonated deep within Daniel. He had spent so much time trying to fix things from the outside, his life, his identity. But it was the work itself, the process, that allowed him to rebuild from within. And as he continued to work, piece by piece, day by day, he started to realize that maybe he wasn't running from something. Maybe he was running towards something. The road had been hard and the journey long, but with each new day, Daniel found himself a little more whole. The days seemed to blend into one another in a steady rhythm. Daniel woke up each morning with a sense of purpose that had once eluded him. The garage had become more than just a place of work. It had become a sanctuary. It was a space where he could measure progress in tangible ways. An engine rebuilt, a problem solved, a day's work well done. Daniel had learned a lot since his first day at Harper's shop, not just about mechanics, but about himself. He found that the deeper he dug into the work, the more he found pieces of himself that had been buried for years. The patience to solve problems, the discipline to keep moving forward even when things felt impossible. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the town, Daniel found himself sitting on the edge of the porch outside the shop, watching the world go by. The sound of a nearby train passing by, its whistle echoing in the distance, filled the air. Robert joined him, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his jacket. "You've changed," Robert said after a long pause, his voice thoughtful. Daniel looked over at him, a bit surprised by the comment. "What do you mean?" Robert shrugged. "When I first met you, you were running from something. Now, I see you moving towards something. It's different." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He hadn't thought much about it until now, but Robert's words had a ring of truth to them. It wasn't just the work, it was the way he was, beginning to understand himself. The uncertainty that once filled him with dread now felt like an opportunity to rebuild, to find a new path forward. "Maybe I am," Daniel said quietly. Robert grinned. "About time." That night, Daniel lay awake in his bed, staring up at the ceiling. The room was dim, the only light coming from the faint glow of the streetlights outside. His mind kept returning to the road that had brought him here. It had been a long journey, filled with pain and loss, but it had also led him to this moment. A moment where he was beginning to feel like he was on the right track. He had no idea where the road would take him next, but for the first time in a long while, that didn't scare him. The next morning, Harper called him into the back of the shop. "Got another job for you," he said, his voice steady. Daniel stepped inside, wiping his hands on his work pants. "What's up?" Harper handed him a set of keys. "Truck broke down up the road. I need you to go take a look at it." Daniel took the keys, a sense of responsibility settling over him. "Got it." The truck was located a few miles down the road, parked on the shoulder. When Daniel arrived, he found an old man standing next to it, his face weathered from years of hard work. "Truck's been acting up," the man said, pointing to the hood. "Thought I could make it to town, but looks like I'm stuck here." Daniel nodded and opened the hood. He immediately recognized the problem. It was a simple fix, something he could handle. As he worked, the old man stood beside him, watching in silence. Daniel could feel the weight of the man's eyes on him, but he didn't mind. There was something about the quiet expectation that pushed him to work even harder, to prove himself. After a while, the engine was humming again, the problem fixed. The old man's face lit up with a grateful smile. "You're good, son," he said, shaking Daniel's hand. "Real good." Daniel smiled back, feeling a warmth in his chest. It wasn't about the praise, it was about the sense of accomplishment. As he drove back to the shop, the truck's engine running smoothly beneath him, he realized something. He hadn't just fixed that truck, he had fixed himself. Piece by piece, day by day, he had been putting the broken parts of his life back together. When he returned to the shop, Harper was standing at the door, waiting for him. "Well?" Harper asked. "It's good to go," Daniel replied, handing him the keys. Harper gave him a small nod of approval. "You're getting better at this." It wasn't much, but it meant something. Daniel had come a long way from the man who had stumbled into this town a few weeks ago. He had found purpose in the work, in the rhythm of it, and in the quiet moments when he allowed himself to simply be. Later that evening, Daniel and Robert sat on the porch again, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The night was calm, the stars beginning to twinkle in the sky. Robert leaned back in his chair and looked over at Daniel. "So, what now?" Daniel thought about it for a moment, then shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe we keep going." Robert raised an eyebrow. "Keep going? Where?" Daniel smiled softly, feeling something stir inside him. "Wherever the road leads." Robert chuckled. "Sounds like a plan." As they sat there in the fading light, Daniel realized that the journey wasn't just about the destination. It was about the steps they took along the way, the lessons they learned, and the people they became. And with that realization, he knew that no matter how long the road was, he would never stop walking. The weeks rolled on, and the days grew longer as summer's warmth began to stretch across the town. Daniel and Robert continued their work at Harper's shop, learning more with each passing day. There was something deeply satisfying about the work, the straightforwardness of it, the clarity of purpose. Every engine they fixed, every repair they made, brought a sense of accomplishment that Daniel had never known before. It wasn't just the physical act of fixing things that kept him grounded, though. It was the way the work tied him to the present. He wasn't thinking about the past anymore, nor worrying about the future. The only thing that mattered was the job at hand, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was good at something. One afternoon, as Daniel wiped his hands on a rag, the quiet hum of the shop was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the lot. It was an unfamiliar vehicle, shiny and new, with sleek lines and a polished surface that reflected the sun in sharp angles. The car parked in front of the garage, and Daniel watched as the driver stepped out. A tall man, dressed in a well-tailored suit, stood there for a moment, surveying the shop with a look of mild distaste. He adjusted his sunglasses and walked toward the door. Harper looked up from the engine he was working on, but didn't immediately acknowledge the newcomer. The man stepped inside, his polished shoes clicking on the concrete floor. He glanced around the shop, his expression cool and detached, before his gaze landed on Harper. "Is this where you work?" the man asked, his voice smooth and authoritative. Harper didn't even look up. "This is where I fix things." "I need a repair," the man continued. "My car's making a noise. I'm not sure what it is, but I'm certain you're not equipped to handle it." Harper finally raised his eyes, and for a moment, the two men stared at each other. Daniel, observing from the side, could see the silent tension in the air. Harper wasn't one to tolerate arrogance, and this man's condescending attitude was starting to rub him the wrong way. Harper's response was simple, but there was an edge to his voice. "If you need it fixed, I'll fix it." The man's lips curled slightly, as though he found Harper's bluntness amusing. "Well, let's see if you can live up to your claim. I'll leave it with you." Without another word, the man turned and walked out, leaving behind the sound of his shoes echoing in the shop. Harper didn't waste a moment. He walked over to the car, popped the hood, and began inspecting the engine with a practiced eye. Daniel and Robert exchanged looks, both wondering what exactly had just happened. The man hadn't even given Harper a chance to explain what the issue was, and his entire attitude had been one of dismissal. "I don't like that guy," Robert muttered under his breath. "Thinks he's better than everyone else." Harper glanced over at them, his gaze still focused on the engine. "People like that are everywhere," he said simply. "You can't let them get under your skin. You just fix what they bring to you and move on." Daniel thought about this for a moment. The man had come in expecting superiority, expecting to be treated like someone above it all. But Harper's response had been calm and centered. He had not been affected by the man's attitude in the slightest. As Daniel began to work on the car, he realized that the lesson wasn't just about the repair. It was about how to handle life's inevitable challenges. The people who would try to bring you down, the ones who thought they were too good for the work, the ones who would dismiss you before giving you a chance. It wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about doing your job to the best of your ability, regardless of how they treated you. By the time the man returned, the car had been repaired. Harper had done his job, and the engine was purring smoothly. The man came back, his face expectant, as though he thought the work wouldn't be up to par. Harper handed him the keys, a silent challenge in the air. The man didn't even check under the hood. He simply got into the car, started the engine, and drove off, the sound of the powerful machine humming as he sped away. "That's how you handle people like that," Harper said quietly, wiping his hands on his overalls. Daniel felt a sense of calm wash over him. It wasn't about reacting to negativity. It was about letting it pass by, focusing on what you could control, and doing the work with integrity. The sun was beginning to set as the day drew to a close. As Daniel and Robert cleaned up the shop, Robert spoke again, his tone thoughtful. "You've changed, man. I can see it. You don't let the small stuff get to you anymore, and you're better at what you do." Daniel paused, taking in Robert's words. "I've learned a lot," he admitted. "Mostly from Harper. He's not flashy. He doesn't talk much. But when he does, it's worth listening to." Robert laughed. "That's true. He's not one for small talk." They stood there for a moment, the quiet of the evening settling over them. The work was done, the garage was cleaned up, and the only sounds now were the chirping of crickets and the distant hum of the town winding down for the night. I guess we've come a long way, Daniel said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Robert grinned. Yeah, but we're not done yet. There's still more to do. Daniel nodded. He knew that there was always more to do. More lessons to learn, more roads to travel. But for the first time in a long while, he wasn't afraid of the journey ahead. He was ready. The mornings grew warmer, the sunlight spilling into the shop with a soft glow. Daniel found himself looking forward to the rhythm of each day, the simplicity of waking up, heading to work, and engaging in the tasks at hand. But what had begun as a place of survival was starting to feel like home. It was a strange feeling, one that he had longed for but never knew how to reach. One morning, Harper called Daniel over to his desk, a serious expression on his face. The steady clank of tools and the hum of the shop continued around them, but for a moment, everything seemed to quiet down. Got something different for you today, Harper said, handing him a set of keys. One of my regular clients needs a special job done, something more complicated. I thought it might be time you took on something more challenging. Daniel took the keys, feeling the weight of them in his hand. What's the job? He asked, trying to mask his growing curiosity. Harper leaned back in his chair. It's an old muscle car, one of those classic models. It's got some problems that require more than just a quick fix. You'll need to diagnose it thoroughly and really understand what's going on with it. I think it'll test your skills. A flicker of doubt crossed Daniel's mind. He had fixed a lot of cars since he'd started working at Harper's. But he had never handled something this old and intricate. The complexity of the task felt daunting, and he knew that there was no room for mistakes. But then again, the fear of failure wasn't enough to hold him back anymore. It had been that way when he first started. Doubts creeping in, wondering if he was good enough, wondering if he belonged. But with each repair, with each challenge, he had pushed those thoughts aside, replacing them with something more valuable. Determination. I'll do it, Daniel said, more to himself than to Harper. Harper gave him a nod of approval. Good. But remember, take your time with this one. Don't rush. Daniel nodded, heading out to the lot where the car was parked. As he stood in front of it, his hands on his hips, he took in the sight of the car, sleek, worn, and with the telltale signs of years of hard driving. The engine gleamed under the hood, and there was a certain beauty to the machine. Despite its age, despite the wear, it had an undeniable presence. The owner of the car, an older man with a weathered face, stood beside him. You know how to work on these things? He asked, his voice gruff. Daniel smiled, trying to hide his nervousness. I've handled a few older models before. I'll be careful with it. The man studied him for a moment, then grunted. Better be. It's more than just a car to me. With the task set before him, Daniel opened the hood and began his inspection. He could feel the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. And yet, as he dug into the engine, something else stirred inside him. A quiet confidence that had been building over time. Hours passed as he examined the engine, traced each problem, and carefully worked through the complexities of the repair. With every step, his understanding deepened. It wasn't just about fixing the car, it was about learning from it, understanding the deeper mechanics behind the work, and growing more skilled. The fear that had once gripped him in moments of uncertainty began to fade into something more manageable. Focus. By the time the sun had started its descent, casting a golden hue over the town, the engine was running smoothly again. The car purred like a well-oiled machine, each part aligned perfectly. The weight that had initially pressed down on him lifted, replaced by a sense of accomplishment. When the owner returned, Daniel stood back, allowing him to approach the car. The man looked it over, checking the engine with a critical eye. After a long moment, he looked up, a faint smile crossing his lips. You did good, the man said. Not many would have been able to fix it the way you did. Most would have given up halfway through. Daniel didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure how to explain the feeling that had come over him. It wasn't pride in the job itself. It was something deeper. It was the realization that he had pushed through his own limits, taken on something that seemed impossible, and come out the other side stronger. He hadn't just fixed a car. He had fixed something inside himself, The man handed him the payment, but Daniel didn't focus on the money. He was still caught in the satisfaction of having completed the job. As he returned to the shop, Harper was waiting, a knowing look on his face. "Did it go well?" Harper asked, leaning against the counter. "Yeah," Daniel said, still absorbing the success. "It went better than I thought it would." Harper nodded. "I could see it in your eyes when you came back in. You're ready for this. I knew you could handle it." Daniel didn't know what to say. The words felt inadequate for the weight of what he was feeling. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging. He wasn't just working for survival anymore. He was working because he had found something that mattered to him, something he was good at. As the day wound down, Daniel stood outside the shop, taking in the cool evening air. The world around him was peaceful, quiet, yet full of possibility. He thought about how far he had come since that first day in the shop. Back then, he was running from something, uncertain of what the future held. Now, he was running toward something, toward a life that felt like it made sense, a life that had meaning. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew that he was ready for it. The days became longer, and the town began to settle into the rhythm of summer. The heat was heavy in the air, yet Daniel found solace in the steady work. The constant hum of engines, the smell of motor oil and grease, had become comforting. The shop was his second home now, and the men he worked with had become more than just colleagues. They were his team, his mentors, his brothers. One afternoon, as Daniel was tightening the bolts on a truck engine, Harper called him over. There was a hint of something different in Harper's voice, a sense of urgency mixed with purpose. "Got a new challenge for you?" Harper said, leaning against the workbench. "This one's not for the faint of heart." A client brought in a rare vintage car. It's a real beauty, but it's been neglected for years. No one else has been able to fix it. They've been to the big shops, but they just don't know how to handle something like this. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "A rare vintage car? What's the catch?" Harper smiled slightly. "The catch is that it needs a complete overhaul. Everything from the engine to the wiring. It's not a simple repair. It's more of a restoration, and it's got a reputation. People have tried to fix it and failed. If we can get it running again, it'll be a real achievement." The challenge was more than just a repair. It was an opportunity to prove everything he had learned, to take everything he'd worked for and push himself to new heights. But at the same time, a part of him wondered if he was truly ready for something this complex. "Do you think I can do it?" Daniel asked, his voice hesitant. Harper studied him for a moment, his eyes sharp, as though he was measuring every word. "You've already done things you thought were impossible. Why doubt yourself now? You've come a long way, Daniel. You know what you're doing. Trust yourself." It wasn't just Harper's words that struck him. It was the calm confidence with which he said them. Harper wasn't just offering encouragement. He was stating a truth that Daniel hadn't fully embraced until now. He had learned. He had grown. And now, there was only one thing left to do. Step up and prove it. "I'll do it," Daniel said firmly, the resolve in his voice growing stronger with each passing second. The next morning, the car arrived. It was even more stunning than Daniel had imagined, a sleek, dark blue body with curves that spoke of elegance and power. The lines were perfect, the kind of design that looked almost timeless. But it was clear from the moment Daniel laid eyes on it that it had been through a lot. The paint was chipped, the tires were worn, and the engine looked like it hadn't seen proper maintenance in years. Daniel opened the hood with a sense of awe. The engine was a mess. Rusted parts, corroded wires, and a general lack of order. It was a far cry from the well-oiled machines he had been used to fixing. This car needed not just repair, but care. It needed someone who understood the intricacies of both the machine and the passion behind it. Over the next few weeks, Daniel poured everything he had into the restoration. He disassembled the engine carefully, cataloging every part and every piece of wiring. It was a slow process, methodical, detailed work that required both patience and precision. The more he worked, the more he realized that this car was more than just a machine. It was a piece of history, a creation that deserved respect. Each day, he found himself growing more connected to the car, more determined to restore it to its former glory. There were moments when he doubted his ability to finish it, moments when the task seemed overwhelming, but he kept pushing through. He knew that the only way to fail was to stop trying. One evening, after working late into the night, Daniel found himself sitting on a stool in front of the car, his hands covered in grease, his eyes tired but focused. The engine was finally coming together. The wires were in place, the parts were aligned, and the sound of the car's once dormant heart was starting to hum again. Harper had been watching quietly from the doorway for some time, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "You've done it, Daniel. It's not just fixed, it's restored." Daniel didn't know what to say. His hands were shaking slightly, the weight of the accomplishment sinking in. For the first time in months, he felt a deep sense of pride, not just in the work itself, but in what it had represented. This car, like him, had been broken down, neglected, and forgotten. But through effort, through perseverance, it had been given new life. And so had he. The client arrived later that day, and when he saw the car, his face lit up with disbelief. This is incredible," he exclaimed, running his hands over the smooth, restored surface of the car. "It looks better than when it was new. How did you do this?" Daniel simply nodded, a quiet smile forming on his lips. Hard work, attention to detail, and not giving up. The client's eyes softened, and for a moment, he seemed to understand. "You've not just fixed a car, you've brought it back to life." As the car drove away, its engine roaring with a new vitality, Daniel stood in the shop, staring at the empty space it had once occupied. He realized something in that moment. It wasn't the car that had been brought back to life. It was him. The work had tested him in ways he never imagined. It had forced him to confront his limits, to push beyond them, and to trust in his ability to rise to the challenge. But more than that, it had shown him that no matter how broken or worn out something appeared, whether it was a machine or a person, there was always the possibility of renewal, as long as you were willing to put in the effort. That afternoon, as Daniel wiped his hands on a rag, Harper came over, his voice quiet but full of pride. "I knew you could do it." Daniel looked up at him, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "I couldn't have done it without you," he admitted. "You taught me how to keep going, even when it seems impossible." Harper smiled, a rare softness in his expression. "You had it in you all along, Daniel. You just had to believe it." As Daniel headed out of the shop that night, the stars beginning to appear in the sky, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The road ahead was still uncertain, still filled with challenges and doubts. But for the first time in his life, he knew that he had the strength to face whatever came his way. He wasn't afraid of the future anymore. He was ready for it. The weeks that followed were a quiet turning point. Daniel had completed the restoration of the vintage car, but the sense of accomplishment lingered. It wasn't just about the cars anymore. It was about the person he was becoming, the version of himself he had worked so hard to build. The shop became more than just a place of work. It was a space where he could challenge himself, learn from his mistakes, and grow. Daniel found that, more than fixing machines, he enjoyed teaching the younger apprentices who came in, sharing what he had learned and watching them develop their skills. Harper, ever the silent observer, noticed this change. He noticed how Daniel had evolved from the quiet, uncertain young man who had stumbled into the shop all those months ago into someone who now exuded a quiet confidence. Daniel didn't just take pride in the work anymore. He took pride in the growth of those around him. His journey, it seemed, had come full circle. One afternoon, Harper called him into his office. The door was slightly ajar, and when Daniel entered, Harper motioned for him to sit down. "I've been thinking," Harper began, his usual stern demeanor softened by a rare moment of reflection. "You've come a long way since you started. Here, you're more than just a mechanic now. You've got a good head on your shoulders, a good heart. It's time for you to take on more responsibility around here. I think you're ready to manage some of the big projects, maybe even run a team of your own." Daniel stared at him, the weight of the words settling on him like a heavy coat. He hadn't expected this. Not this soon, at least. He had always seen himself as a part of the team, never its leader. But then again, he realized that was exactly what Harper had seen in him all along. It was the very thing he had been afraid of. Stepping up, leading others. But now it didn't seem like something to fear anymore. I don't know what to say, Daniel said quietly, trying to process what was being offered. I'm honored, but I'm not sure if I'm ready for that. There's still so much I'm learning. I don't want to mess up. Harper's gaze softened. I get it. Leadership isn't easy. But you've got something that not everyone has. A sense of responsibility, a willingness to learn, and an understanding of what it means to build something from the ground up. Those are the things that make a good leader. You don't have to be perfect, Daniel. You just need to be real. And you're real. Daniel paused, taking in the magnitude of the offer. It wasn't just about fixing cars anymore. It was about shaping the future of the shop, shaping the future of the people who worked there. And for the first time in his life, he felt like he could truly make a difference. He had spent so long trying to prove to himself that he was capable, but now he saw that the real test wasn't just about proving his own worth. It was about proving that he could help others rise too. I'll give it my best shot, Daniel said finally, his voice steady with a newfound resolve. I'll take on the challenge. Harper's smile was subtle but genuine. I knew you'd say that. You've got the heart for this job. That's what matters. Over the next few months, Daniel slowly began to take on more responsibility, managing repairs, overseeing projects, and mentoring the newer members of the team. Each day brought new challenges, new lessons, but it was never overwhelming. He was no longer running away from the pressure. He was embracing it. He had learned that true growth didn't come from avoiding challenges, but from confronting them head-on and refusing to back down. As he stood outside the shop one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange, Daniel reflected on how far he had come. The boy who had walked through those doors months ago, uncertain and lost, had been replaced by a man who knew what he was capable of. The doubts, the fears. They were still there, of course, but they no longer held him back. He had learned that fear wasn't something to avoid. It was something to confront, to use as fuel to push forward. The shop, the team, the work, it was all part of a larger story. It wasn't just about fixing cars. It was about fixing the parts of himself that had once felt broken, incomplete. Every challenge he faced, every difficult task had been a stepping stone toward understanding who he truly was. Daniel wasn't just a mechanic. He was a mentor, a leader, and a man who had learned the value of persistence, of resilience, and of believing in something greater than himself. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the town, Daniel smiled to himself. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, he didn't feel afraid. He was ready, and in that quiet moment, as the world continued to turn around him, he realized that the journey had never been about reaching the destination. It had always been about the strength to keep going. No matter how many times he stumbled along the way, Daniel had learned to rise, to push forward, and to never give up. And that, he knew, was the true measure of success.